The first few days of Task Force Lima, we would see people paying like $5 million for very simple AI chatbots, and then some people paying $10,000. One of the most fascinating findings we had was Chinese-based models like DeepSeek beat out Meta's models, LLaMA models, which is just counterintuitive, even for things like US military logistics. We demoed it for a CENTCOM commander, and he was like, this is incredible. We need to field this. How good is it? And we really had no metrics to point to. Preparing the Pentagon for AGI looks like building these secure model pipelines. So taking models from the AI labs, getting them into government accredited clouds, and putting them in front of end users. Welcome to the Model Citizen podcast. I'm Glenn Parham. On today's episode, I actually gave the keynote address for the Department of Defense's and Department of Energy's joint AI for Energetics conference workshop. It was an immense honor and privilege to do so. These are very, very smart people. I talked about my experience being the technical lead for the Pentagon's Generative AI Task Force, Task Force Lima, the barriers and blockers that we ran into for generative AI across the US military. By the way, the largest organization in the world, and what the future is for what we're calling AI government alignment, how we make sure we have the right compute, how we make sure that the models don't just guardrail us and say, hey, as an AI model, I cannot do XYZ military actions. I just want to thank again the Department of Defense and Energy for inviting me to give the keynote address. All right, let's dive into the episode. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for inviting me today. It's a real privilege and honor to be here with such esteemed folks like yourselves. Shout out to the previous speaker. Incredible work that you guys are all working on. So yeah, my name is Glenn. My last job up until I took this fork was leading generative AI. I was a technical lead for DoD. So the title of my slides, Preparing the Pentagon for AGI. I know people are rolling their eyes at home. I get it. But hear me out, guys. We're going to reflect on the DoD's Generative AI Task Force Lima. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about, kind of the vision we have for AI, what we're calling AI government alignment. And I will probably save most of the questions to the end, but if there's anything pressing, let me know. And I have 25, 30 minutes, right? Is that right? Correct, Brian? Up until 11? Great. Sounds good. Let's get started. A little bit about me. Again, led generative AI for the Secretary of Defense's Chief Digital and AI Office. That's CDAO. You'll hear me referring to that a lot throughout this presentation. I'm a software and AI engineer. I led engineering for the Pentagon SWAT team of nerds, the Defense Digital Service. I published the DoD's first LLM ops framework almost 2 years ago now, which is kind of insane to think about. So I'll go into that a little bit. My background, actually, I was very passionate about politics. I had a data science and CS background, founded a company and a research organization focused on that. And that's what actually brought me out here to DC a few years ago. All right, so Task Force Lima, the DoD's Generative AI Task Force, that ran for about 2 years. And I'm going to kind of go over at a high level what happened, what we learned, and what we didn't learn. All right, so the context, ChatGPT's dropped November 2022. In DC and the senior levels, a lot of discussion and discourse as to generative AI and the prospect of it and what we're going to do about it. So Task Force Lima comes out in August of 2023. It's mandated by the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the previous one, Dr. Kathleen Hicks. And the idea was, okay, we need to develop, evaluate, recommend, and monitor generative AI across the DoD, which is, the largest organization in the world. So, it's kind of a very high mandate. And there soon after, we had the Biden AI executive order that came out a few months later. In the bottom left corner of your screen, that's Dr. Craig Martell, who was the previous chief digital AI officer, or the first one for the Department of Defense, who launched Task Force Lima at DEF CON. So we're almost exactly, I don't know what today's date is, but we're almost exactly 2 years out from this anniversary. So I was the technical lead at Task Force Lima. And so kind of the main dimensions of the efforts we have are, I would largely consolidate into these six classes. So I'm going to briefly touch on these. From a policy perspective, all right. So Task Force Lima, we kind of essentially were mandated to create interim guidance for using using generative AI in DoD. I literally went to DISA and audited all the NIPR logs. So we could see people going to chatgpt.com and like we were like, all right, we need to come up with some guidance. We had to come up with guidance about how to use generative AI at a high level, pretty bare bones. I mean, our guidance was saying like, don't put TSSCI into like to ChatGPT and these sorts of things, but also things like codifying accountability. Like if you use something like an AI chatbot, you are liable for how it's used and the responses that it outputs. You can't just pass the buck or pass the blame. So that was in pretty early on to Task Force Lima. And then we had the different military departments come out with their own generative AI guidance, which is interesting. Some were way more restrictive than others. And then, one of the hardest things to tackle was authorizing generative AI. Again, this was back in like 2023. If you're in this call, you probably are remotely, somewhat exposed to the idea of having an authorization to operate. That's basically the authorization of software or, these systems to operate in, government or specifically the national security world. And they're granted by these authorizing officials. And so our struggle was figuring out how to convey risk to these authorizing officials, the people who give the rubber stamps, when people wanted to authorize these like unbounded large language models to be used in like a million different ways. So that was really difficult. And so the way the mechanism we did that was we would convey that, all right, if the use cases are low stakes enough, we're using these AI chatbots to help rewrite emails or do kind of very high level, low stakes, low consequence tasks, then it should be low risk enough for authorizing officials to grant that authorization. Kind of these two classes emerge in terms of authorization of large language models. So the way you authorize and the constraints you run into with open weight models and closed weight models were like kind of different. When it comes to open weight large language models, they were easier to get authorized and access to. We could literally just pull them from the internet, right? But they were harder to use because these weren't like managed services that were had like any provisional authorization. AKA, let's say we wanted to run the LLaMA models, we would have to obviously bring our own compute and authorize the entire software stack there. One of the biggest moments that kind of transformed and opened up the floodgates for Meta's flourishing throughout the Department of Defense was when we coordinated with Meta to have them grant us, the US government and the DoD, an exemption for using LLaMA in military domains. That was really huge. And then on the closed weight model side, that's harder to get authorized and access to, but like easier for developers to build with. Because the way it works is you have to essentially get provisional authorizations for the OpenAI models, Anthropic, Google, et cetera, via the cloud environments. And that can take like 1 to 2 years and can be really frustrating. But once it has that provisional authorization, it's much easier for developers to come in and leverage. This is one of the things I did a lot of with Task Force Lima was experimentation. So, the ethos of the Defense Digital Service was to learn by doing. So we had a bunch of different projects where we experimented with stuff. Hackathons, we participated in the Bravo Hackathon series. DEF CON, in the bottom middle photo, that's me demonstrating connecting AI conversational agents, I think back in 2023, into radio networks, which we then deployed to the 18th Airborne and different parts of DoD. And then on the right side of the screen was our generative AI multimodal powered robot that was called Combi. And then we also demonstrated a number of things, one of them being integrating large language models into cyber defense operations. So streamlining the amount of time it takes for security operations center analysts to write up incident reports and things like that. All right, evaluations and alignments. There was a realization that the DoD needs DoD-specific benchmarks for generative AI for large language models. And so the main players were largely Scale AI. They provided us with an attempt on a benchmark, a MIL-bench, which was something that came out of Major Ruiz, out of Army Futures Command, and MILGLU, which came out of MIT. These were DoD-specific benchmarks. And what I came out with almost like a year and a half or 2 years ago now was Axon, which was the DoD's large language model ops framework. So I'll briefly kind of go over this. The idea was it was an open weight it was a series of open weight large language models fine-tuned on DoD domains. So these slides are what we launched with. And it was the idea that we wanted to take open weight LLMs, fine-tune them on like unclassified publicly available DoD information as a proof of concept. And then we also hosted them on our CDAO Hugging Face, which I think is the largest or one of the largest Hugging Face organizations. I'm still the admin of. They need to revoke my access. But we published Axon 7B policy, which was essentially a fine tune of Mistral 7B model on like DoD policies. So the stack was, we took these DoD issuances. You can think of these like very high level kind of sec def policies and memos, converted that into a Q&A synthetic data set via GPT-4, fine-tuned that, and then hosted the model and created like an application on top of it. Really as kind of like an end-to-end stack for people to be inspired across the DoD to build their own thing. So diving into this a little bit more, we basically crawled like WHS.mil and pulled out, I think it was 80 like DoD issuances and memos, and extracted the respective text from there. So here are these kind of code snippets I'm including. Converted that into a synthetic Q&A data set, which was pretty cheap to do. And we came up with, I think, like 800 Q&A pairs. And then we, via Google Colab, we had a CUI authorized version of Google Colab, essentially. Use an A100 to do quantize low-ranking adapter, supervised fine-tuning on the model. And again, not super impressive. This was back in 2023, so it was more impressive back then. But really, it was operated as a proof of concept. And so one of the things that we, once we got this kind of end-to-end proof of concept done, I was like, all right, let's figure out, how we could actually bring this more into the DoD. So we partnered with the DoD's HPC MP program and basically recreated everything I did, but on the DoD HPCs compute and their GPUs. And so that was a really good project because it really exposed me to the actual bottlenecks of like the compute constraints that people in DoD are exposed to. And it leads to my next point, which was what was hard with Task Force Lima was trying to predict the number of GPUs to be allocated across different impact levels and air gap networks. It'd be easy if we were all operating on, the internet and everything was connected to the internet because we could easily reallocate resources. But when everything is so disconnected, it becomes like really hard to have that foresight. We also had to confront things like, how do we pay for compute? Do we pay for it centrally? Do we pass on the cost to end users and customers throughout the DoD? What's the market rate? How much should we be paying for this? The first few days of Task Force Lima, we would see people paying like $5 million for very simple AI chatbots, and then some people paying $10,000. We're like, all right, well, we need to figure out what the actual market rate is because the disparity in the spectrum is so wide. And then we did a lot of work with NIPR-GPT, getting them funded to help them scale up to the now, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of users that they have. Sorry, the NIPR-GPT is like the DoD's AI chatbot, for those of you who don't know. And then I think this might be one of the last things for Task Force Lima. There was a community component, briefed the White House, DoD, DOE, kind of what I'm doing now, on how people were using generative AI. One of my favorite things that I did, I had these things called large language model office hours, where I gathered 200 like DoD AI scientists and practitioners every couple of weeks, and we'd catch up on the latest advancements or the latest bottlenecks. So, one tangible way that this kind of moved the needle forward was in one of the meetings, like people were complaining to me about them not being able to use the meta models because Meta has the LLaMA models because Meta had a prohibition on military use. And so we took that and took it for action, worked our way up the right channels, and ended up Meta granting us an exemption for military use. So things like that, actually I can kind of take pride in. And then we also did a lot of open source contributions, published different tutorials of how to use LLMs in the DoD context. We also had our Hugging Face organization, things like that. And we published this final report. I'm gonna be real with you guys. Like, it was a very high level report. It was kind of a politically sensitive time with the outgoing administration and the new one. So nothing in here is going to be particularly fascinating. Yeah, we had lots of operational use cases. Generative AI is rapidly changing. We need more evals on the stuff, and we need to scale things like NIPR-GPT. You can actually go look this up. This is public. If you just Google Task Force Lima, it should be one of the first documents that pop up. I think it's like a couple of pages. All right, so moving beyond this, I since I've been on the outside or quasi outside government employee, I've been kind of thinking about the future of like where this is all headed and what our perspective path to AGI could and should be. Won't go into this too much. The idea of artificial general intelligence. I know this is a very controversial topic in these circles, but the idea that how Google defines it in their labs, are the ability for AI to learn any intellectual task that a human being can, fundamentally. And over the past year, we've seen more government officials, like, for example, Ben Buchanan, Biden's former AI advisor, kind of go on podcasts and talk about this at length. They really care about the government's role in regulating AGI and prospectively AGI, what that's going to be. I care more about the government as a user of AGI and how that can actually come to fruition. Fundamentally, preparing the Pentagon for AGI looks like building these secure model pipelines. So taking models from the AI labs, getting them into government accredited clouds, and putting them in front of end users. And so like here's what in an ideal world, an ideal scenario, that rollout of AGI to DoD would actually leverage pre-existing pipelines. It's not something that would just like, it would be our first time approaching this. I think we could actually do this in short succession. We would have the AI labs have this claim that they've achieved AGI. These models would be largely disseminated and distributed across the different DoD impact levels, the cloud service providers, and then the DoD would run a whole suite of benchmarks and evals to confirm that it does achieve this AGI status. And then we would actually be able to put this in front of users, whether that's things like NIPR-GPT or Microsoft Copilot, things like that. And so I actually submitted to the White House a couple of like 4 or 5 months ago, it kind of a pathway and lines of effort that the government needs to take to kind of get to this point. So you can go read about this on my website, glennparham.com. It's like 14, 15 pages. It touches on things from like specific clauses in the federal acquisition regulations that need to be modified for like data governance and data rights, to how we can authorize things faster, how we can incentivize like AWS to invest in their compute infrastructure more. So very specific recommendations. And I'm very happy to say that a lot of what I advocated for, we were able to get into Trump's AI action plan, which was released 2 weeks ago, largely things around AI workforce, national security compute investments, chatbot mandates, getting that in front of everybody, and streamlining authorization. So obviously, it's much, we're moving into this execution phase of the AI action plan, which is easier said than done. But I'm really, really excited about this, and we're going to be kind of partnering with them. So my argument is that like the Pentagon's path to AGI is highly predicated on these pipelines, but mostly on these benchmarks. I have this kind of funny story. I was building this generative AI application pertaining to like the counter UAS space and for CENTCOM. And this is about a year and a half ago. And we demoed it for CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla. And he was like, this is incredible. We need to field this. How good is it? And as I was reflecting on this, post taking the fork, I was like, that's such a good point, because we really had no metrics to point to, no way to evaluate the models that we were using. Were the models that we were using highly performant in the counter UAS space? Like we literally had nothing to point to. And this is going to be the biggest barrier to getting this stuff authorized in government. And so I've created this entire like entity and company, nonprofit 501c6 with my co-founder, Justin, kind of solely focused on this, and we're calling it GovBench. And kind of the higher level way we're communicating this stuff is AI government alignment. We just released a whole podcast episode on what kind of our approach here, but I'll try to, for time's sake, glean over most of this stuff. Basically, we understand that the status quo today are that guardrails are often activated on DoD specific or just like general government work, and that can be really frustrating for a lot of people, especially as we're spending billions of dollars just in the Pentagon alone on these like massive contracts with the main AI labs and the AI companies. And then we also understand that we have limited access to chatbots across the different impact levels and so forth. So really our alignment objective is to maximize the AI coverage, the number of people in government who have access to these AI tools and AI systems, and the utility. So we don't want people just using this stuff to like try to write poems or like rephrase an email. We want people eventually to be able to have this authorized for operational use. Maybe they're doing supply chain optimization in the South China Sea, things like that. That is really not even on the table today. And so we have these like high level expectations of alignment on the side of AI and on the side of government. Things like we expect AI to stay law compliant continuously. And then on the government side of the equation, we expect the government to provide domain evaluators to help coordinate and create these benchmarks, to retain chatbot history, and communicate really stable and clear AI standards. Things like what agents should be the permissions that they should be exposed to, things like that. And then our operating environment. One thing I learned about like Task Force Lima is you have to have like crystal clarity about the different players and the different levers that they can pull. And so what we're really communicating and advocating for with GovBench is what the private sector and the government's comparative advantages are and what they each bring to the table and how they can work together. So one of the things that might be most relevant to this audience that we published a few months ago was Joint Staff Bench as part of GovBench, which is really our effort to evaluate large language models against the DoD domain. So you can see the distribution and scores here. These results are a little bit outdated. I think they're from like 2-ish or 3 months ago. We have more results that we haven't released yet. But kind of our methodology here were to take these like fundamental joint pub doctrine documents, convert these into question answer pairs in the form of free form, in the form of multiple choice. And then we use the UK's AI security. They're now called the AI Security Institute, not Safety Institute. Their framework, their inspect framework to actually run the evals, and we publish the results. And we ran this against the different joint directorates in the military. We also ran this against like small language models. We understand that edge inference and edge compute, that's a lot of the work that I did while in DoD, is a huge deal. So we ran this against these smaller language models, which was of a lot of interest to people. And, one of the most fascinating findings we had was the fact that like when it came to open weight models, we had Chinese-based models like DeepSeek beat out Meta's models, LLaMA models, which is just counterintuitive, even for things like US military logistics. And, that was kind of probably one of the largest headlines and our biggest pitch to why the government needs to continue to subsidize and at least invest in open weight models. So our alignment roadmap here, we published V1 of this joint staff bench. We're rolling it out to a bunch of different COCOMs, military departments, vendors, and the AI labs. We're currently actually in the process of releasing the V2 of joint staff bench, which incorporates more human in the loop and a couple of other things. And then eventually we've been working with different cabinet level departments to coordinate on creating department specific benchmarks outside of DoD, state, treasury, HHS, et cetera. And so that's really what we're focused on the benchmark side of the equation. And then we also understand our role and the importance of education and advocacy, public engagements where we actually communicate the need for benchmarks and evaluations. You'd be surprised how controversial benchmarks and evaluations are. People are like, why do we need benchmarks? We can just use agents. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? But yeah, we have these public engagements and then also advising government leaders, whispering in, the ears of people in the Pentagon, people in the White House, and so forth to kind of steer this in the right direction. Because as I mentioned before, it takes a balance of government partnership and, private sector alignment. So yeah, I'll see the rest of the time for Q&A. We have a podcast, or I came out with a podcast recently, Model Citizen. Shameless plug to go listen to that. We talk about the Pentagon's GPU crisis, AI government alignment. We're interviewing the founder of NIPR-GPT soon. That'll be up soon. And a bunch of other really fascinating people that I think you guys will take interest in. For more information on everything I just talked about, you can Google Task Force Lima, look at our final report, which you'll kind of be underwhelmed by. Sorry. Check out Model Citizen wherever you get your podcasts. Go to my website, glennparham.com. We have Bringing LLMs to the U.S. Government, that document that I submitted to the White House that kind of got fed into the Trump's AI action plan. And yeah, check us out on GovBench. If you're interested in partnering with us, you'd like us to roll out our joint staff bench to wherever you are in DOE or DoD, we're also partnering with our allies and, kind of military bodies all over the world. Definitely reach out to us. We could kind of quickly get a partnership or create it going. And yeah, that's my contact information. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. All right. So I know that was a lot. I threw at people. Happy to take any questions or concern and from the audience. Not sure if anyone has any, but here's an AI recording of the questions that were asked during the Q&A section of this talk. First question, how does your idea of AI government alignment differ from standard model safety alignment, red teaming, preventing harmful behavior? Yeah, I guess what you're talking about is the work of alignment that like these AI labs have been doing to make sure that these models don't partake in like nefarious behavior. Is that kind of that might be touching what you're touching on? It's fascinating because kind of my argument is that these lots of work is being done on red teaming these models. I go to DEF CON every year. This year I'm not, but DEF CON where they run these like AI red teaming challenges to kind of almost like fish for these nefarious behaviors that might emerge across the different model families. So what's been fascinating to me is I think that largely is being solved for. It's not solved, but it's, the efforts are there. The reason why I'm working on like AI government alignment is I just don't really see concerted efforts. Anthropic has done some work with this. They actually released some government specific models recently, like kind of forks of like their main sonnet and their main models that are focused on like the government's interests. The government has unique authorities and sanctions for use of force and the military and things like that. And so that's been kind of one thing that's been fascinating to me is like, how are we going to reconcile and, merge in basically preventing all of these like nefarious behaviors that are found commercially in these models with, aligning it to government's interests. Like that is kind of a hard problem to solve for because if you're using these AI chatbots in government, you want to be sure that they're not going to have all sorts of, especially these like Chinese models, which we're doing a whole podcast episode on Chinese models with some researchers. You want to make sure that they're not engaging in nefarious activity and that they're safe to use. So sorry, I don't have a perfect answer for you, but it's one of the, definitely listen to our episode on it coming out soon. Next question from the audience. How do we get past the generic as an AI model, I can't do X guardrail when X is a lawful authorized military task? That's been one of the biggest frustrations is people, in DoD and especially national security world, they get that guardrail of like, as an AI model, I can't do this. And so that's why one of our expectations of alignment, I'd refer you to like number 5, enabling government exclusive authorities, where the DoD is authorized and sanctioned to do this research, right? And so AI aligned government should enable this, and then also configuring risk tiers and having that be something that could be kind of preset or configured. That's one thing in a government of millions and millions of people. Obviously, people are going to have different levels of risk. If you're like a first responder versus someone who's like processing paperwork somewhere, that there are going to be different levels of risk. And so that's what we're communicating to the AI labs is to be able to like to set that risk. So yeah, thank you for the questions. Next question. What are some of the good AI use cases that have emerged? That's a good question. I think I'll touch on like NIPR-GPT, which is the DoD's largest like AI chatbot. They now have at least 400,000 users. It might be as great as 700,000 now, which is just mind boggling. I remember when it was like, 3. But what I will say is right now, these AI chatbots are not and will not be able to be authorized for anything kind of beyond administrative work, not discounting the importance of administrative work, right? I know the DoD like runs on paperwork. I totally get that. But for example, NIPR-GPT doesn't have the actual authorization for like operational use, right? Connection to kinetic systems or lethal systems is like totally out of the question. And so I think right now everyone is exploring how to use these chatbots for administrative use, and we should continue to do that. My argument is that if we want to get to that point, I mentioned that anecdote with General Kurilla and our CENTCOM counter UAS use case, that will never get authorized until we have benchmarks and evaluations that actually are able to clearly convey to the different people, the CIOs, the authorizing officials, what the risk is there. So I guess to answer your question, we don't know really what tasks AI shouldn't handle. I don't want to definitively say that it should never handle, kinetic systems, because we really aren't in a place to even experiment with that yet. And so what we're working on with AI government alignment is to get to that point of even experimentation, and then we can kind of iterate from there. Last question. How can we make sure that these AI models work well for US military or national security tasks? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what's inspired this work is we saw these benchmarks emerge. My co-founder, Justin, actually works at OpenAI and Stanford. He released SciBench, which is like the premier cybersecurity benchmark was actually just released in yesterday's OpenAI releases. But I totally agree. The benchmarks kind of fell short when it comes to national security. I would largely say it's because people in these labs, and they would admit this, like just don't have exposure to national security, and it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And so where, our comparative advantages with GovBench is we have that national security background. And so we can understand what like the priorities of national security are, the different use cases that are actually practical, not, exclusively CBRN or things like that. I say like these AI labs are doing more investment and poaching public sector or like national security folks. That my former person at CDIO, for example, now leads OpenAI government, their government entity, government arm. So yeah, I think like we are so early, and I think this is like the first iteration of evals, but we have so much more work to do. And so that's kind of where we're creating this effort here. Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.